Welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about doing unsupervised cluster analysis. And what we're trying to do here is as we talked about in the principal component analysis, oftentimes the data that we have, if we could take and plot our data in some sort of, dimensional space and be able to just do a major scatter plot, our brains would be able to pick out that there were clouds associated with the groupings of the items. And again, if we just looked at it in two-dimensional space, X's and Y's, and did our scatter plots, oftentimes we could see a linear trend, but other times we may see groupings. We may see a grouping that's clustered down on the bottom left and a group that's clustered up on the top right. If we just keep expanding that into space, we could go, three-dimensional, four-dimensional, whatever else. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to say, are there characteristics that are going on here that naturally group together in little clouds? Because if I can identify those clouds based on my current data set, then I can go back in the future and look at other things that are being added that I don't know about, get the characteristics of them and say, you know what? This behaves more like a cluster 1 or a cluster 2 group. So that's what we're going to do. This week we're going to go and do clusters. Your book shows you how to do that in R. I'm going to show you how to do that in Solver so that you can use Analytics Solver for this. You're going to use your protein data, and you can see I've already started doing some analysis here on the bottom. But using your protein data, if you go into data mining, and in data mining, you'll click on clusters. K-means clusters, and what we're doing with K-means is K is the number of clusters that you want, and we're going to build them around the mean or the average center of the cloud that they're associated with. Okay, so K-mean clusters. You can see here that I have chosen all of the variables with the exception of country. There's nothing about country that's numeric, so trying to do some sort of a numeric analysis on it doesn't make sense. All the data here is included. I'm going to go next. And to start us off, let's just start with two clusters. Because with the cluster analysis, as the book tells you, you kind of have to make the decision on how many clusters you're going to have. So let's take a look, because we need to start wrestling with our data here and say, what is the right number of clusters to get to? All right, so I'm going to put 2 there, iterations 10. Let's do random start 3 times and set a seed for it. You can set whatever seed you want. Go to next, make sure show data, summary, and show distances is done. And if you click on fixed, you're going to get an output that looks similar to this. Okay, again, should be very, very, very similar, but it will give you, for the random starts, yours are going to be slightly different. It's going to tell you the average center for each one of these clusters. Okay, so if I was going to be able to take and put this in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-dimensional space, the average center for cluster 1 for red meat is 11.8. The average center for cluster 2 for red meat is 7.7 or so. Okay, again, this is the mean for white meat on the number of grams of protein, eggs, etc. Okay, so what we have here, if you look at the cluster centers, for cluster 1, the way that they have been arranged, cluster 1, this is your data. Cluster 2, this is the data for the centers. Set yourself up a new sheet called graphs. Let's bring that over. Okay, cluster 1, cluster 2, you can see the way that I have taken and put these in here, red, white, eggs. This is just a copy paste of the data that you have from your output. Okay, copy, come to graphs, paste it in. Then if you take this data and you do a line chart, okay, just a line graph, and input it, this is what it tells you. It shows you that cluster 1 countries, whatever they may be, is the blue line. Cluster 2 countries is the orange line. Now, what we need to be able to do for our clusters is describe it. Based on the way that the means come out, what makes cluster 1 significantly different than cluster 2? Oftentimes we do that by describing it. So for example, the description that I've put on here for cluster 1, you can kind of see from cluster 1 that it's more balanced, if you will, than cluster 2. Cluster 2 is really high in cereals and lower in other areas. Cluster 1, as I mentioned, it's a little more balanced with milk and cereals being predominant, but with eggs, fish, nuts being lower. Okay, so that is the way I described cluster 1. What about cluster 2? Cluster 2, once again, significantly high in cereals. So whenever I'm grouping these countries and I only use 2 clusters, that would be one way to describe them. Well, which countries even fall into those clusters? If I go to my output on the clusters, it will tell me that record 1 belongs to cluster 2, record 2 belongs to cluster 1. You're like, oh, okay, I get it. So take and copy this information, open yourself up a new sheet. Let's list those as, and I'm going to go ahead and sort these again based on alphabetic. And again, Albania is a cluster 2 here. Austria is a cluster 1. Once you get these in here, come back to your graphs and put in the countries that belong to cluster 1 and the countries that belong to cluster 2. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to build my argument on how many clusters are here and what the description of those clusters could be and the countries that kind of belong to them, okay? Again, countries that eat more, the higher cereal diets, and that's Albania, Bulgaria, Czech, you get the point, all right? You're going to go through and you're going to repeat this cluster analysis for 3, okay? Yeah. For 3 clusters, for, oh, why is that missing here? For 4 clusters, and then for 5 clusters, okay? What we're trying to do, once again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to see how many clusters really make sense, all right? The way that you know you're kind of getting close to the end on the number of clusters is you can see here for 3 cluster, there's still a pretty good difference here between countries based on cereals. Not as much on eggs, not as much on starch, but you can still see that there is the cluster 1 group here kind of matches the gray group, the cluster 3, until we get to cereals, and then cereals really kind of breaks them apart. And then they kind of stay together through the rest of it. But a 3 cluster makes sense to me because, again, they're still breaking out pretty good based on cereal. Do a 4 cluster. On 4 cluster, again, what are we seeing with 4 clusters? All right, so the orange cluster here is 2, gray cluster is 3. Not much change here, but let's see what happens here with cluster 2 and 3 as it continues to go on. You know what? Whenever it's orange, cluster 2 really has a lot more milk than cluster 3. There does appear to be some distinct characteristics here between clusters 2 and 3. So a 4 cluster probably still makes sense. Take it to 5 clusters. Okay, in this one, you can kind of see we've got a grouping here once again of clusters. This is cluster 1, cluster 2, and cluster 3 are all kind of together. They break out a little bit here for milk. Maybe there's a reason to keep plus 5 clusters. You could do a 6th cluster if you want, just to check on them. But your assignment is, once again, to go in. I want you to build different models using 2, 3, 4, 5 clusters. When you get in here, so for the 2 cluster model, I need a graph, I need a description, I need you to tell me the countries that are there, okay? Same thing for 3. When you get to 3, I need you to give me the data, give me a graph, give me a description, give me the countries. Same thing for 4 clusters, same thing for 5 clusters. And then at the very bottom of it, somewhere on this page called graphs, I want you to give me a final summary. Okay, and in this summary, I need you to tell me if you think that it's best to go with a 2, 3, 4, or 5 cluster analysis of it. And once you tell me, how many clusters you want, tell me why you went ahead and picked that group. All right, that's your assignment this week. Break these things up into clusters. You can either do this in R, you can do it in using Solver like I did, or Python if that's what you prefer. All right, good luck. Let me know if you need help.